Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. We've got a change of scenery. I used to be positioned way over there so you get this view of the skyline of BGC buildings. We're just moving the camera over here. It's a lot more cooler. We're in the shade. Still on the rooftop, but yeah. Now, in this video we're talking about one thing that's was probably more important than the camera body, which is your lens. You could have a fairly affordable, fairly cheap camera body, but if you pair it up with quality glass, you can get amazing results image quality wise. So getting a good lens doesn't automatically make you a better photographer. You have to remember that a lot of things still come into play, but again, it does improve the image quality. In this video, we'll talk about the two most common lens types, which are primes and zooms. We'll go over focal lengths, and the most commonly used focal lengths ranging from wide, standard, and telephoto. Then we'll go over their general uses, we'll talk about image quality, and then we'll of course discuss crop factor and why that's important. We'll just skim over that. Now, in terms of types of lenses, the two most common types of lenses are prime lenses and zoom lenses. There are other types of lenses, but are less common and usually built for specific use. So we'll focus on mainly primes and zooms. So prime lenses, they have a fixed focal length. They can't be zoomed in or out. Aside from being relatively smaller to zoom lenses, they also have a wider aperture. I say relatively small because lenses can get big depending on the price range. More expensive lenses tend to be bigger, more affordable lenses tend to be smaller, more compact. Now, prime lenses are relatively more affordable to their zoom counterparts, and some say that it even has a better image quality. The downside, though, is you do need a couple or more primes to have a range of focal lengths in your arsenal. And this is why we have zoom lenses. Zooms the focal length is usually a range that can be zoomed in and out, hence zoom lenses. The name zoom lenses. The trade-off is that they are relatively, I stress on the word relative here a lot, they're relatively larger than their prime lens counterparts. Their aperture doesn't go as wide as that of a prime lens, and they tend to be relatively more expensive to their prime counterparts. The longer the range of the focal length, we also notice that the image quality tends to suffer. So you'll notice that there are zooms that are like 16 to 35 millimeters in length. And then you'll notice that you have some zooms that have a wide range, like 24 to 240. And those with a wide range, like the 24 to 240, the image quality tends to suffer. Or the aperture range would suffer. So it's an engineering thing. So let's take a look at a comparison from prime and zoom lens. Actually, if you could give me a second here. So, to give you an idea, this is a kit lens for the Sony. This came with my A7 III. It is a 28 to 70. And to give you an idea, this is a 50 millimeter f1.8. So in terms of size, you can see the 50 is really small, right? The aperture on the 28 to 70 ranges at 3.5 to 5.6, meaning it's 3.5 on the widest, but as you zoom in, it goes to 5.6 as its widest, while as the 50 has a wider aperture of 1.8. So this is what I was talking about in terms of relatively smaller in size. The prime is relatively smaller. In terms of image quality, that is debatable. This is one of the most hated lenses, which if you want to check out why this is the most hated lens, I'll probably put a link up there. All right, so focal lengths and uses. Now we will be focusing on the three most common and generally used focal lengths. At the same time, we'll talk about what they're commonly used for. And do note that I may say these are their common uses, but remember that lenses of all focal lengths can be used for whatever purpose. It's a matter of, does it fit your composition, does it work for what you're trying to do? All right. Now, generally, first of all, we have wide lenses. Wide angle lenses range anywhere between 16 millimeters to 35 millimeters. These lenses have a wider field of view, which tends to capture more of the scene that is in front of you. These are normally used for landscape and architecture. So if you plan to do landscape shots and you want to get a lot of the scenery, or if you plan to do architecture shots where you want to capture the space of the building or the height of the building, and a wide lens is usually what you'd want to use. Mainly because if you use a longer lens, your field of view is more narrow, you'll have a hard time getting everything in a shot. Next up would be standard lenses. Standard lenses range from 35 millimeters to 85 millimeters. Specifically, the range between 35 to 50, they say that it's the closest to what the human eye sees. I'm a lot more biased towards the 50 millimeter lens. I think it's a lot more natural to what the eye sees, but it really depends as well on the lens manufacturer, as in not all lenses are created equally. Not all 50 millimeters are the same, right? Now, standard lenses are very versatile in their use. This includes anything from street to travel to portrait. Like I said, 35 to 50, if you want to get like a general all-purpose lens, you want to get anything in between that range, and you'd be able to use it for a lot of things. Portrait-wise, I'd suggest something like 85. Street and travel-wise, I'd suggest something like 35. But if you want a good in-between, 50 is a great in-between for all of that. So next up, we're talking about telephoto lenses, more specifically short telephoto lenses, because there are telephoto lenses that reach an insane length in terms of focal length. They have an insane reach. Now, these lenses, short telephoto lenses, range from 85 millimeters to 135 millimeters. These are lenses that, there are lenses that go even further, as I mentioned, but generally they are all telephoto lenses. So uses for telephoto lenses include street, definitely portraits, because you get better blurred out backgrounds, better depth of field, and most especially wildlife, because hey, you can't come up to a cheetah with a 35 millimeter lens, because you're going to get mauled. So you want something like a 135, a 200, probably even something longer, so that you're a fair distance away. Now, take note that, as I mentioned earlier, the longer the focal length, the shallower the depth of field. But also, this makes camera shake more obvious, meaning a slight shake of the hand is going to really show on a longer focal length. So, we're going to take a look at how that would affect a photo. We're going to look at a wide, a standard, and a telephoto lens, and just to show you the effects of a focal length. So, we're going to keep the subject the same size in frame, and I'll switch lenses. So this means that I'll be moving closer with a wider lens, and then I'll move further away as I get to a longer focal length. Okay? So let's take a look at that here now. So we've got our little Naruto figure here in frame, and we have the 85 millimeter f1.8. So as you can see, I'm a bit of a distance away here. Well, not a bit of a distance, about 1.5 feet away, 2 feet. And we've got him nice and focused in center, and we will take that shot at f2.8, and we're going to switch lenses, and we'll eventually we're going to compare images. So let me go ahead and switch out the lenses first here. So to give you an idea of what it looks like, this is the 50 millimeter, and we're shooting at f2.8, but as you can see, this is what it looks like from the current standing point of where the 85 was. You get more in frame. So we'll take a shot there for comparison. There's the 85, there's the 50. So we're going to move closer to what the 85 looked like, which would be me moving So this is at 50 f2.8, keeping him relatively the same size as the 85. There we go. Let's move on to the next wider lens that I've got. So just to give you an idea, this is how far we currently are from that, right? We've got our nice little figure over there, but we're now using a 28mm f2 lens at f2.8, and you can see how far or how much more of the environment it includes, and we're standing as close as it was with the 50mm lens. So we're going to take a shot of that for comparison later, and now we're going to try to move closer. So here we go, I've adjusted the tripod and we are this close to the figure. He's right there. So from there to here. So he is relatively the same size and shot. And there we go. So we have 3 comparisons. We'll go to the screen and take a look at comparing those 3 shots. So going to the 85mm shot, you can see here that at f2.8 we really have a very thin depth of field. You can see that the figure is in focus, the buildings you can't really make out in the background, and even the foreground there, if you look at the ground, it's also blurred out. If we go to the 50mm shot at the same position, you can see that it has a lot more in frame, way a lot more in frame. But if we try to keep the figure relatively the same size, you can see that in the background you get more, surprisingly more of the buildings. Like, you can actually make out those are buildings in the background. They're blurred out, you don't see the details. And even if it's the same f2.8 aperture. So that's what I was saying in terms of a longer focal length, giving you a shallower depth of field. Now if we look at the 28, if we try to keep him relatively the same size, in comparison to the 85 and the 50, he is relatively the same size, but you can see in the background we have more of those buildings in back there. You can even see more of the wall here on the right side. And I'm very close, as I showed you, I'm very close to the figure. Again, this is at 28 f2.8, and I'm very close to the figure, so we get lots of very shallow depth of field. But as we move further away, f2.8 on a 28mm lens won't give you that much depth of field. Again, we're photographing something really small, really tiny. And look, here's what it looks like in my hand. This thing's really small, so photographing something really small up close will give you a lot of depth of field. And it's something we can probably talk about in the future. But yeah, there we go. So we're going to talk about image quality. Have you ever wondered why one lens, say 50mm f1.8, costs X amount, but another 50mm 1.8 costs probably twice as much, probably even sometimes 3 times as much? Well, any modern day lens is of good quality. However, lenses, they have flaws, and more expensive lenses try to address these flaws. Common lens flaws are loss of sharpness or contrast, which happens wide open. So when you're wide open, you're going to notice that the image looks soft and not as sharp. You lose a bit of contrast. And even sometimes when you stop down, which is due to diffraction. Normally lenses are sharp at the center and they become softer as it goes out to the corners, right? In more expensive lenses, they try to address that. That's why you get corner to corner sharpness. Another flaw that you'll notice is chromatic aberration, which is that odd discoloration you usually see in highly contrasting edges. So like if I was a backlit, like, you know, the image quality might be nice, but around the edges where the light hits, you're gonna get some weird purple, red, green colors. Something that's not really there. It's just how the lens handles contrasting colors in edges. Vignetting is the gradual darkening of the edges as it moves further away in the center. So like the corners, you'll see a nice vignette on some lenses around this side here, around here. It's like that darkness and that dark edge, and it becomes clearer or brighter as it gets to the center. And that's what vignetting is. Some people actually like that and will think of it as a lens quality. Some people don't. It really depends on what you use it for. But more expensive lenses tend to give you better control over the vignette. And you usually see that when the lens is wide open. Barrel distortion or pincushion distortion, which is the warping of the images. It's what makes a person look thinner or wider, because with barrel distortion, this gets warped this way. With pincushion, things tend to get pushed in this way. And barrel distortion happens usually with wider lenses, and then as you get to longer focal lengths, you tend to see pincushion distortion. But again, not all lenses are created equally. Sometimes you'll get barrel distortion on longer focal lengths, and sometimes you'll get pincushion distortion on wider focal lengths. It really depends on how the lens was engineered by the lens manufacturer. So these flaws, again, as I mentioned, usually appear on the more affordable lenses when the lens is wide open. So if you have an affordable 50mm 1.8 like I do, that 50mm 1.8, as I mentioned, is one of the most hated lenses. It wouldn't produce the best image quality wide open at 1.8. You're going to see a lot of those flaws. So you'd want to stop down to improve the image quality. So some shooting at f2.8, 3.5 improves and gets rid of all those, not all, but most of those flaws. So more expensive lenses would perform similarly regardless if it's wide open or stepped down, meaning an expensive 50mm 1.8 wide open would perform just as good as if it was stopped down to f8 and stopped down at f22. There will be difference in terms of image quality, definitely, because you're changing the aperture and the lens changes, but generally you will see less variation and less flaws, less imperfection. Now, one thing we do want to touch on, which we'll take a look at here in a moment, is crop factor. It's the last thing we want to talk about, and it's just a bit of a reminder. So if you're using a micro four thirds or an APS-C camera, this would have a crop factor. This is due to the sensor being smaller than that of a full frame camera, where the full frame camera is a 1:1 crop factor, meaning 85 is an 85. Why is that though? Well, full frame, they were developed to be the same as a 35mm film in terms of size, so it's a 1:1 factor. APS-C is a smaller sensor, so APS-C has a crop factor of 1.5. For Canon, it's 1.6. And all you have to do is the crop factor, you take that crop factor and multiply it by the focal length of the lens. So if you had a 50mm lens on an APS-C camera, you multiply 50 by 1.5 and you get 75. So a 15mm lens on an APS-C camera looks a lot closer to what a 75mm lens looks like on a full frame. And I'll show you what I mean here in a bit. Let's take a look at this here. So I want to show you something in terms of crop factor here. So we have our little figure way over there, and we're using a 28mm lens. So we have him centered near the bottom, and we're going to take a look at comparisons in a moment here on the screen. But this is how crop factor falls into play. This is a 28mm lens. And I'm going to take a picture here. 320 f2.8 ISO 100. You know what? Let me slow down that shutter speed a bit. I want them a bit brighter. So we're going to be at f2.8, shutter speed of 200, ISO 100. Let's take that shot. Now, what if we took this 28mm lens and put it on an APS-C camera with a crop factor of 1.5? So, luckily enough, the Sony cameras have an APS-C mode built in, meaning I can get that 1.5 crop factor. And if we take a look at 28mm lens at on an APS-C, would be closer to a 50mm lens. To give you an idea of how far we are, we're fairly close. But it'll be a lot more like a 40mm, 41mm lens. So Sony, wonderful enough, does have an APS-C mode, so it shrinks the sensor. The downside is that if I'm on a 24 megapixel sensor, if I go to APS-C mode, I'll be on a 10 megapixel sensor or something like that. And clearly now you can see here that is a big difference. Let's take a shot here. That is a big difference from an APS-C to full frame. Full frame and APS-C with a crop. But it's technically the same image. I'll show you here in a second. It's a lot tighter. It's still a 28mm. It's just that you're cropping in about halfway. So the aspect of the buildings are still the same. If we take a look at it here, let's go to a monitor over here. So if we take a look at it here, there is our figure in the middle, and then if we crop in, it's exactly the same image, it's just cut off. So that's what it means to have a crop camera. Your 50mm lens or 28 or whatever lens you have, it's the same lens, it's just that you don't get the full image, it's cropped in. And this is why some lenses are built for full frame 50mm, and you have a crop 50mm lens. And if you use a 50mm lens built for APS-C, you're not gonna get the full image, and you're gonna get something like this with heavy vignetting. Something to talk about in the future, but it's a good thing to show you, good comparison. And luckily enough, the Sony has APS-C mode, so I can show that to you. But that is what it looks like. It's a pro, is it a pro or a con? Well, crop mode has its pros and cons, but it's something for us to talk about in the future. Or crop factors has its pros and cons. But that's another topic in the future. That concludes this video. There's so much to talk about in terms of lenses, but as for the basics that a beginner should know, I think we've covered everything that you should know, that a beginner should know. So I hope what I shared helps you understand a bit more about lenses, and more importantly, it helps you make decisions as a photographer in terms of choosing what lens to buy and what lens to use for whatever you're working on. So there we go. Again, I hope this was helpful. If you made it to the end of the video, a big thank you. And I'll see you in the next episode, next video. Cheers.